So, thank you very much for honoring us and gracing us with your presence for this end of February lecture in the series, in the Pourdavoud lecture series on ancient Iran. I would, in a moment, leave the task of introducing today's speaker, Professor Margaret Root, in the better hands of my dear colleague, Professor Elizabeth Carter. I just wanted to, at the beginning of this lecture, to thank again our Getty colleagues for providing for the means to undertake these exchanges with the Getty scholars and to allow them to also have a forum within UCLA for us to benefit from their wisdom and also their scholarship. So my thanks goes obviously to Dr. Sakira, Dr. Jeffrey Spear, my good friend, and Team Potts at the Getty for having facilitated these exchanges. So without further ado, I just pass on the word to Elizabeth Carter. Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Margaret Root here. Margaret and I have known each other for many years. I don't even want to think how many, but at least 45. And Margaret received her PhD at Bryn Mawr, in fact, all her degrees at Bryn Mawr, and then moved to the University of Michigan in 1978, and eventually became professor of art history, as well as a curator and director of the Kelsey Museum. She's received many honors and awards, including a Guggenheim in 1985, and much recent funding for her work along with Mark Garrison on Persepolis ceilings. Her first book, The King and Kingship in Achaemenid Art, Essays in the Creation of an Iconography of Empire, was truly a groundbreaking work that integrated social history and iconography and the idea of imperial program in a kind of readable, interesting fashion, something that up to that time had not been done before. I'm particularly fond of her 1994 edited volume because I have an article in it, The Persian Empire, Continuity and Change, but it is truly one of the finest of this series and has many wonderful articles. I also have consulted on numerous occasions her volumes with Mark Garrison, and in particular, Seals on the Persepolis fortification tablets, images of the heroic encounter. Think this, and you think heroic encounter. And I'd want to mention, I couldn't possibly mention all of her publications, but I want to mention one here that's sort of a little out of left field, but nonetheless very interesting, a catalog that she did in 2005, Fertile Land, Signs and Symbols in the Early Arts of Iran and Iraq. And again, something that I have used in my work on prehistoric stamp seals. Today she is going to talk on Kingship for a New World and look at Achaemenid art in its global perspective. What was the impact, not of the first big empire or world empire, but what was the impact of its thinking on the thinking of other empires that would be like it. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Margaret Root to UCLA.
Thank you to Liz Carter for that nice introduction. Thank you to Professor Shea again for your invitation to participate in the work of the Pourdavoud Center by addressing you all today. I also thank Marissa Stevens for myriad courtesies and efforts, and I thank the Getty program and its stewards, I should say, and I thank all of you today for coming. My aim this afternoon, First is analytically to portray critical features of the program of Achaemenid art as I've come to understand it so far over the course of the last 40 plus years. By Achaemenid art, I mean specifically the official art of the empire as it was fully developed and canonized in the reign of Darius the Great. At this time, the empire had reached its full extent from the Indus to the Danube and across North Africa. We see it most comprehensively in the built landscape of Persepolis and the royal necropolis nearby at Nakshi Rustam. Now, whenever I refer as shorthand to the Persian Empire or Persian kingship or kings in this talk, I will, unless specifically noted otherwise, mean the Achaemenid Persian environment as distinct from later ancient Arsacid, Parthian, Sasanian manifestations of kingship and empire. So, end of lessons. In tandem with my broad characterization of Achaemenid art, you know what I mean by that, I will very selectively contextualize this art against a backdrop of social life in empire, gleaned from visual and textual evidence of the archive of sealed and dated administrative documents on clay, known as the Persepolis fortification tablets. Roughly 20,000 tablets were excavated by accident that is when they were clearing for a light railway track, 1933-34 from offices of the casemate fortification system along the northeast sector of the Persepolis platform. The tablets date between 509 and 493 in the reign of Darius. They're primarily records of disbursements of commodities from court stores in the Persepolis catchment area to individuals or individuals acting on behalf of others, engaged in a variety of activities. The seals used in the corpus offer glimpses of individual resonance with the program of Achaemenid art amongst people actually experiencing the environment and the empire. Their owners came from elite and lower levels of the social hierarchy. Now, the second part of my talk today pits the vision I will have offered of the Achaemenid Empire through its visual self-presentation against two of the negativistic tropes that persist in Western scholarship. Heavy historiographic burdens continue to inhibit serious conversation about how Achaemenid art and the society that existed in its midst could possibly have had any positive, ideologically affirming resonance around the world, either in its own era or in later antiquity. More specifically, these burdens hinder discussion about how Achaemenid art could possibly have offered profound emulative models to the planners of official state monuments, either west or east of the military tributary purview of the Persian kings. The imperial structures of Persepolis were built on the takht, Persian for throne, which itself was built early in the reign of Darius. The takht backs up against a mountain ridge at the east, forming a natural defense there. Mud brick fortification walls raised atop the takht extended along most of the north and south, and also at the east, where they followed the crest of the mountain. A section along the west, in front of the western portico of the Apadana, and at the southwest corner, seems to have remained unenclosed by this defensive system. At the southwest corner, a low-lying wall adorned with horns sets this small area apart and suggests that this sector of the takht encompassed some ritual functions. at least at some points during Achaemenid times. Just east of the southwest corner, Darius built a small stone staircase leading to the Taht from the southern part of the plain below. Here, cuneiform inscriptions proclaimed different aspects of a royal message in the three languages typically used for trilingual parallel texts, beginning with Darius, as we witness the practice first on the Behistun monument: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Here instead, each language is used for a specific, discrete statement. The Babylonian section describes the empire as on this wide earth on which are many lands, with people speaking many languages, coming from different terrains, desert, mountain. Most dramatically, on the west facade, the public face of the Taht, where Darius began the great gateway finished by Xerxes, the masonry was composed of massive polygonal blocks meticulously joined. In its original state, it resembled a jigsaw puzzle of beautifully fitting, though differently shaped and scaled parts. Ravages of time have disrupted and geological problems have disrupted the smooth intended finish of the surface, but the intent is quite clear. This is a labor-intensive type of masonry. Now, perhaps in part, this choice of masonry style on the Taht was meant to proclaim that Darius could command vast human resources to create such a thing. And of course, he could. At the same time, though, this visual and material manifestation bespeaks a more symbolically nuanced message, I think, echoing word concepts of the Babylonian text on the south. After walking in a slow and measured fashion up the broad but very shallow steps of the double reversed stairway, steps that lead first up and outward and then up and inward, one reached the entrance. By this point, the visitor was very much a participant in a spatial and visual experience that situated him along and within this massive jigsaw notion of language, dress, place of origin. The messaging of text and architectural dynamic reinforce each other, proclaiming the majesty of the imperial project and its inclusiveness. The architectural dynamic simultaneously suggests that there is some expenditure of effort and decorum required in return for the promise of inclusion, though. We must make an effort. The monumental gateway looms ahead as the eye of the needle, its inscription telling us that Xerxes completed the project begun by his father, declares the structure to be the gate of all lands. Doesn't it make you homesick for visiting Persepolis again? Founded right on the heels of Darius's reconquest of Egypt in 518 BC, Persepolis was geographically at the center of Persian imperial hegemony. Robert Rollinger urges us to consider the Persian Empire as an ancient world manifestation of globalism. And what I glean from the visual record, as it conjoins with official Achaemenid texts, comes into meaningful dialogue with this. The discrete regions of the empire were not physically defined by literal boundaries marked out by surveyors to create discrete units in the modern sense of nation states. It did not self-present in this way either. Furthermore, beyond the composite military economic domain of the great king, strictly speaking, were border zones of cultural permeability and lively tensional exchange, as Rollinger has also emphasized. Certain texts of Darius may delimit the extent of military tributary reach at a given moment in his reign, but they do not indicate an ethos of finite closure, I submit. Rather, rather they suggest an ethos of order in a world of possibilities. Thus, for instance, when Darius reconquered Egypt, one of his first acts was to dig the Suez Canal, opening up a sea route to the Persian Gulf and beyond, as you can continue there around the Indian subcontinent, if you figure out what's there. Stone stelae, over 6 feet tall, were set up along the banks of the canal, advertising this achievement and its promise in Egyptian as well as in the 3 cuneiform languages. The visual presentation here reinforced a pious universal complicity in, and even collective adulation of, the great work of the great king. But we hasten to return from the Nile Valley to Persepolis, whether by land or by ship. Our main focus will be on the audience hall of called the Apadana, designed and largely completed in the reign of Darius. Sets of a trilingual text inscribed on gold and silver foundation tablets enclosed in stone boxes were buried under the corners of the Apadana. This text is an outward pressing statement that names 4 corners of extent of conquest at the time. It defines the center and distance away of its radiating worldly energies, but it does not characterize the limits and limitations, the finite boundaries of those energies. So in this text, the Apadana becomes a material and spatial metaphor for the spiritual center of the empire, with the implication that the king was metaphorically coterminous with that center. Now, tellingly, the decision to deploy numinous gold and silver tablets under the Apadana reflects the informed choice of a very ancient Near Eastern tradition that had heretofore been used specifically for temple, not palatial foundation deposits. I use the term spiritual here not to connote canonical religion or religious practice. I use it rather to connote an ideal of spiritual harmony and ordered well-being that was at the core of an ideology of Persian kingship, as we can glean it from the visual record and the official text record. Tunnels channeling waters from the mountains at the east down under the Takht and out to the plain below ran directly beneath the Apadana. They were planned and installed at the outset of the Takht project. Now, whether this placement was determined with any reference to the concept of the very special building that would soon be raised above, I cannot say for sure. But the connectivity of flowing waters and spiritually charged places, was a critical feature of the ancient Iranian experience, as Matt Canepa made so clear here for us back in January. The elaborate column bases on the porticos of the Apadana suggest columns supported on the tips of inverted lotus flowers. In intended aspect, the flooring came just to the tips of the petals so that the massive columns appeared conceptually to be floating, levitating. This is watery imagery. So although I cannot demonstrate how considered was this architectural feature invoking waters flowing below the structure, the tunnel apparatus between the Apadana beneath the Apadana required and received ongoing maintenance in Achaemenid times. The waters as a reality of the built landscape will have been well understood as a factor of the whole. Columns with elaborate floral bases were not limited to the Apadana or to Persepolis for that matter. I suggest here simply that the Apadana of Persepolis was a particularly multifaceted structure in its symbolic and material ensemble. Furthermore, about hypostyle halls, the space inside the building offered large participatory interaction, as Hilary Gopnik has discussed very cogently. Lori Kachadorian's 2016 book, Imperial Matter, discusses how this idealized setting worked of the hypostyle hall with elaborate floral columns, worked in the social imaginary of Achaemenid Armenia, witnessed by a site that she's excavating there. When we look at the exterior superstructure of the Apadana, we find a kind of dramatized, spiritually infused resolution of the outward projecting, numinous, textual material underpinnings of the royal audience hall. On the north and east facades of staircases that give access up to the Apadana porticos, the same representational program, more or less in mirror image, plays out. Today, to avoid confusion, I'm going to show everything from the Apadana as it appeared on the east facade. Gets confusing. The iconic expression of Achaemenid ideology finds elaborated expression in these Apadana reliefs. As originally designed, Darius and his crown prince appeared in audience to receive a bowing official. This scene was the fulcrum of the extended composition. We understand that when the bowing official straightens up, a ceremony will get underway. Everyone is waiting. On wing B, behind the audience scene, members of Persian society in alternating riding costume and courtly garb range behind the royal pair in 2 rows. And above, a cortege of the royal chariots and equestrians implies the just previous arrival of the royal entourage and the awaiting of the time when they will again depart the audience after the ceremony is over. On wing A, facing toward the king, are ranged delegate peoples of 23 lands of the empire, dressed variously and bearing a variety of gifts. The first man in each delegation, though, bears no gift, for he is taken by the hand, poised to be ushered forward to greet the King of Kings. This imagery reinvents an iconography that held extraordinary resonance in the ancient Near East and Egypt. In Mesopotamia, we see the motif of a pious petitioner, typically a ruler, being led forward by the hand or wrist toward a more exalted and enthroned entity, either a deified king or a god. In variant guises, the motif is perpetuated down into the first millennium. We can trace it as a major image on seals, as well as on freestanding votive monuments. In Egypt, the motif is particularly associated with depictions of the highly charged liminal moment in which the deceased is led by Anubis to the scales of last judgment, and thence before the god of the dead, Osiris, for the ultimate verdict. Archaic Greek art produced before the Apadana now, and thus potentially serving as an additional model for it, offers some limited but interesting evidence about legacies of the imagery as well. Here, leading a personage into the presence of a higher being was associated with the story of the introduction of the hero Heracles to Olympus for deification after he had successfully completed all his labors. A very fragmentary stone pediment relief from the archaic Athenian Acropolis temple relief portrays such a scene, and here a roughly contemporaneous painted box indicates that the imagery manifested on a temple facade was echoed in at least a small corpus of portable objects destined for the household. The Greater Mediterranean was already, obviously, a place of intensive exchange for hundreds and hundreds of years prior to the Achaemenid Empire. Now, with the Achaemenid experience, we're seeing a crystallization of multiple ideas brought to bear with great deliberation upon a new project. The aim of it was to create an art for a new world order, an art that would speak in many languages to all kinds of people. It's worth noting here that in all three contexts that we've just looked at for models, the individuals being led as petitioners into the presence of a greater being are themselves high status figures who are in the throes of an opportunity to gain something very special. We contemplate the gift bearers on the Apadana with that notion of already elevated stature set into a framework of potential benefit. The king, in turn, achieves his own even more elevated stature in this representational context. He is literally the king of kings, the king of all other kings. Now, the sculptural formula, the way the motif is actually rendered in stone, the sculptural formula for rendering the hand-holding on the Apadana is elegantly paralleled on one late period Egyptian tomb relief of a member of the royal house. The formula consistently rendered on every preserved, you see it there, yeah. The formula consistently rendered on every preserved group across both north and east facades of the Apadana provides a neat physical entwining of hands and fingers that metaphorically locks each Persian court usher and his lead delegate from the non-Persian peoples, near and far, into a kind of intimate collusion of liminal moment. Each delegate group is poised to be activated to start moving forward to appear before the king and crown prince. We see a set of frieze frames that evokes the notion of discrete cylinder seals rolled out on the building facade as if it were a vast clay tablet landscape. Each notional seal impressed on it will, in the mind's eye, eventually take its place before the focal image of the enthroned ruler who awaits gifts of praise from the great world far and wide that Ahura Mazda created, as Darius proclaims in his tomb inscription. These gifts are a big topic for another talk in March. Here, I'll continue to focus on three principal intertwined factors of the Apadana program as an ideological schema writ large. One, its emphasis on dynamics of immanence and its correlate subtexts of judgment, of assessment. Two, its portrayals of interpersonal engagement and its correlate subtexts of attentiveness. And three, its portrayal of notions of individual and group identities within the larger human community that is the Persian hegemony. All these features play out on the Apadana and are reinforced elsewhere in Achaemenid art. Guard figures line up on wing A and wing B immediately before and behind the enthronement scene in the view you see here, behind it. These are ramrod straight, self-contained officers doing exactly what they should be doing. In formal terms, the rat-tat-tat of the guards rhythmically urges the visitor, who actually climbs the stairs along with them, firmly forward and upward to the culminating of actual experiential space, which will be inside the Apadana itself. In actualized performance, then, the king would probably have been enthroned in state for ceremonial audiences at the south interior of the main hall. This place is directly opposite the north entrance to the Apadana, the one first encountered when approaching the Apadana from the Gate of All Lands. Also, this south side of the main hall backs up against a suite of storage rooms for courtly paraphernalia, which also gave private royal access out to the south. Every king needs an exit strategy, right? You've got to have a place to disappear. Now, the south side of the hall also gave access up to a staircase leading to the flat roof of the hall. The king may have performed open-air ceremonies there. Speaking of ceremonies, vestiges of a throne emplacement suggest that the king also appeared in the west portico, where the vista, unimpeded by fortifications, gave out onto the plain. Moving back from the rat-tat-tat of the attentive guards, things are lively amongst the Persian nobles, who are the backbone behind the king. Restless chatting, adjusting of garments, intersperses with figures standing in quiet dignity, all enhancing the scene of eminence we've already noted. These nobles are anticipating the start of the great ceremonial performance about to begin. On Wing A, occasional instances of a Persian usher turning around as if to becalm the man he's taken by the hand give intimate immediacy to these reliefs. Generally characterized as frozen and deadly, these sculptures are, within their intended framework of highly formalized courtly decorum and style, quite talkative. We're within a social space here where a notion of human interaction is part of the imperial vision. We glimpse a different social space through seal applications on the Persepolis fortification tablets. Many of these clay documents are sealed by multiple individuals, and we can trace them frequently engaging in a kind of conversation with their seals. Clearly, when people came together at disbursement stations to receive their requisitioned supplies, there was talk and often playful engagement around what a person's seal would look like when applied variously to the tablet surface. Because the tablet had to be still damp to receive seal impressions and text, we are entitled to appreciate this seal activity and the gabbing that went on around it, occurring with all participants present at the same time and in the same place around the tablets. One example of this is PFS 66, showing impressions of a cylinder seal we know from applications on multiple tablets. The impressions yield this composite line drawing, and the seal matrix, the cylinder seal carved with the image on it, showed a design depicting an enthroned figure receiving a man followed by a winged creature. This image on its own echoes the solemn audience imagery of the Apadana, although the motif of presentation to the king has taken an interesting turn. The seal application on this tablet has played with the seal, showing off its potentials for different effects. The results of this seal play, as I like to call it, also echo the Apadana reliefs. On one edge, the application singles out the head of the enthroned figure and repeats it carefully, seeming to mimic the rat-tat-tat of guards on the Apadana. On another surface, the application does something really funny. The seal user has rolled out the seal partially to present the enthroned figure, and then has picked up his cylinder and deftly rotated it to place the winged creature in the lap of the impassive seated personage. This is not that easy to do. I've tried it, I've fooled around. This one example shows a discursive environment in Persepolis with individuals at home with the grand imagery on the talked and able and eager to play with it. There are many more examples of this. Now back to the Apadana itself. The gift-bearing delegates are all set within a paratactic grid, operating horizontally and vertically. The horizontal divisions are embellished with a rosette border motif, which in natural terms may be meant to portray a blooming sunflower fully open. It's ubiquitous in the built landscape of Persepolis. Symbolically, this floral element invokes notions of abundance and fertility, fecundity, that have a long history in Iran. The delicacy of their carving with softly concave petals, crisply edged, invites an appeal to the tactile as well as to the visual sensibilities. Individual cypress trees create the vertical demarcations of the grid. Here, the detailing is extraordinary and again invites a multisensory apprehension. The tapering end of each cypress tree reaches all the way to the top of the horizontal bar above it. The Persian ushers and the delegates in their charge are just a shade shorter, so that they have a bit of breathing room, but they reach to the level of the cypress trees as they swell. The effect is to make the humans and the trees to the same basic scale. These trees are more than a simple vertical device. The care and artistry of their detailing in itself bespeaks a sensibility to affective agency. There are certain symbolic connotations of the cypress tree, moreover, in cultures of the ancient Greater Mediterranean, which may have played into choices here. But with limited time, I want to note its valences of meaning in later Iran. In the Shahnameh, the cypress tree is repeatedly used as a metaphor for beauty and nobility. Scholarship on orality and epic tradition in Iran considers ways in which oral traditions, alive already in the Achaemenid period, probably informed poetic traditions later, recorded by Ferdowsi in his national epic. The iconography on the Apadana situates all the peoples of the king's world order against the measure of the cypress tree. As they approach their audience before the great king, they are attaining the stature of nobility and majesty, symbolized by this revered tree. At the beginning of my discussion of the Apadana reliefs, I mentioned that the central panels depicting the king enthroned were part of the original design, and a critical element of it at that, of course. As many will have seen the structure today, though, the central panels show Persian guards flanking inscription panels. The original panels were indeed removed from the Apadana, apparently in the reign of Artaxerxes II. Their original placement was proven definitively in the 1970s in probings by the Italian restoration team. The audience panels, the original ones, were installed instead in Court 17 of the Persepolis treasury. Now, it has sometimes been intimated that the motivation of the removal was to put Darius into a kind of purgatory. Get him off that place. We don't want to see him anymore. In fact, a space syntax analysis by a graduate student at Michigan, Matt Naglak, demonstrates how highly trafficked this room in the treasury actually was. This fits in very well with further studies of the coloristic elaboration of the room, analyzed by Alex Noggle. Court 17 of the Treasury was the pivotal axis of access into the rooms of the Treasury. It also became a special, unusually elaborated space for paying some kind of homage to the Persian king, whether in his aspect as an historical figure, Darius and his crown prince Xerxes, or as the generic notion of an Achaemenid king of kings. For me, the entire situation doesn't feel like a shaming at all. Over the course of time, various buildings in Persepolis acquired altered uses. The idea that Darius and Xerxes were moved here to a hidden place in ignominy is just not reflected by the archaeological record. And furthermore, it buys into a classical trope in which these two kings, especially Xerxes, who had the audacity to threaten mainland Greece, of course suffered utter humiliation, even at home. Before leaving the Apadana, a word about the sculptures that replaced the original ones. Whoops. They depict guards framing an inscription panel. To our eyes, they seem perfunctory. They cannot compete with the royal audience scenes, of course, in anchoring a narrative context for the broad relief program spread across each facade. Nor can they rival the original scenes in pure visual interest. For us, anyway. That said, the self-containment and sameness of the guards are not necessarily indices of a lack of social resonance in their time, place, and social space. Like the original central panels of the Apadana, these reliefs present figures who are at ground level to the visitor and which are roughly the same size as the adult visitor. Both sets, the original audience and the replacement courtiers framing inscription panel, were intended to be spatially participatory with the human condition. This matter of scale and physical access is important both for intended meaning and for reception. The architectural participant is not distanced from the figures. He shares their space and by implication their world. Iconographically, the figures of the guards were not necessarily perceived in their day as nameless, homogenized entities. They may have been perceived by the visitor, the Achaemenid period visitor, as representations of the social order that belonged to or aspired to belong to the king's closest inner circles. At Susa, molded brick reliefs present such figures. Here, fragments of a central panel inscription preserved the name Otanes. Otanes was one of the Persian comrades of Darius who helped him solidify power after revolts in his first year, famously recorded on the cliff face at Bicetun, as well as by Herodotus. In some circumstances, such figures set in non-narrative arrays may have been intended to be legible at once as generic men of the empire and also as specific individuals of historical note within the memoryscape of the empire. Now this brings us to the tomb facade of Darius, hard by Persepolis at Nakshi Rustam. The imagery presents the king atop a great platform, standing before a blazing fire altar, a blazing fire with the winged figure hovering in the sky above, along with the sun and moon emblem. This is a worshipful scene. Below the king, personifications of the lands of the empire, joyfully, cooperatively lifting the prayerful king on high. Each personification is identified by a caption, the Elamite, the Babylonian, so on. Additionally, two figures posed like guards behind the king bear name captions. Gubaru, known from Herodotus as Gobryas, is one. He's another Persian noble who was instrumental in Darius' successful kingship. Although none of these captions was really legible from the ground, paint embedded inside the cuneiform wedges will have made the fact of them somewhat visible. Most important for us here, though, is that it was considered relevant to acknowledge their names in writing on such an important royal monument. Gubaru hints at the potential for figures of presumably generic men, generic guards in Persepolis, to have had identities as representations of real people, in other words, real people of substance. They may have borne inscriptions in paint too. They're now long gone. We just don't know for sure. But the reliefs were elaborately painted. Even if they didn't necessarily bear name captions, the guards at Persepolis, the idea, I submit, of the generic standing for real people of the court was out there. One could see oneself in these figures. Now, the motif of supporting figures on Darius's tomb facade was drawn deftly from age-old Western Asiatic and Egyptian traditions, where in both streams it signified cosmic uplifting and support. Here, however, the cosmic concept was applied to a socio-political realm in which the astral element, the raising up of the heavens, may well be implicated in an ideology of spiritually based, numinous sacral kingship. Seals on the Persepolis fortification tablets include imagery of figures in cosmic postures. On these seals, the motif is consistently spiritual and astral. In the age of Darius, within the Persepolis milieu, the implications of the motif of uplifting like this was well understood. Its transference to a representation of the peoples of the empire would also have been appreciated as a statement of distinction in a world order, where the peoples of the empire have assumed the stature of cosmic courtiers of the harmonious hegemony. Adding even more to the tomb facade imagery, we note the two personifications on either end of the great platform on the outside. These figures pose in naturalistic rather than symbolic mode. They imply that in an actualized performance, the king is depicted as about to be not only cosmically lifted and held aloft, but also literally moved in state, in pious splendor. Like any good furniture movers, the man who must walk backward because the royal platform is to be moved in his direction looks behind himself to make sure he doesn't miss his way and cause catastrophe to the court. There's a charming immediacy here, and one can almost hear somebody say, "Look out, look behind you." There's a very human personhood inherent in this detail, despite the solemnity of the whole. The feature of imminence, the display of a liminal moment on the very brink of enactment, fulfillment, is something we've met already on the Apadana. So too, the intimation of dialogic personhood woven into the representation. Returning quickly to the symbolism of a world of people harmoniously acting in concert. The Egyptian-made statue of Darius, excavated at Susa, is really important here. The inscriptions make it clear that it was intended as a votive statue for an Egyptian temple, but it was moved to Susa during the reign of Xerxes to become a gateway sculpture there. In traditional Egyptian visual terms, the idea of uplifting the pharaoh, of uplifting the Persian king that we see on the statue of Darius was directly adapted from a long tradition of colossal pharaohs on pedestals decorated with figures of bound captive enemies, the traditional and iconic enemies of Pharaoh. The Achaemenid translation of this imagery conforms to the programmatic vision of Darius and his court that we've already seen. Look what's happened to the figures from Egyptian tradition. They're unbound on the statue of Darius. They raise up their hands in a gesture that connotes palms up, a gesture that connotes activated ritual bringing forward as a determinative or descriptor of meaning in Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. The imagery we see on the royal tombs and in the statue of Darius was intended from its planning to speak multiple languages. It was intended to have affective resonance worldwide. That is, in as many directions and extents as the Persian king saw his world reaching. What Darius said in the Bisitun inscription was a core stratagem of his empire from that beginning, to send his message out to each in his own language. While we may take this statement literally in the Bisitun text, and we know from evidence of the text elsewhere that it's true, we also realize that the words applied to visual translations of the core of the imagery. For the Bisitun rock relief, this meant, for instance, that a Babylonian version was set up as a freestanding monument in Babylon, and it was adapted to a Babylonian political and spiritual context. Now, the Bisitun relief is often characterized as the only depiction of an historical event in the official art of the Achaemenids. This works only up to a point. The sculptural rendering depends upon a summary text at the end of the long trilingual inscription. Here, blow-by-blow narratives of military adventure in far-flung campaigns led by various generals have been distilled to a summary statement of symbolic synthesis. In this textual synthesis, it is the great god Ahura Mazda who delivers the captive rebels to Darius's hands so that Darius can determine their fate according to his virtuous judgment, which of course has already been informed by Ahura Mazda. And this is what we see in the Bisitun relief. It is yet another liminal moment, albeit an agitated action moment. Darius acknowledges the confidence that Ahura Mazda has placed in him to be the earthly judge representing the god's interests. He has one foot firmly on the torso of the squirming prostrate pretender to the throne. And one can hardly escape the notion, just from the sculpture, that this rebel has been assessed negatively. But what about the others? The thrust of the visual message is that, one, the king is the righteous judge, and that, two, each person still in line will be judged according to the king's values of truth over the lie and cooperation overall. The rebels are stooped and bound, but not groveling. Although weaponless, they remain clothed and unscathed. In theory, on a case-by-case basis, one or more of them might walk away a whole free man. Such devices of liminal representation inspire dialogue. What's going to happen? And it's easy to imagine when standing beneath the Bisitun monument that storytellers were around, eager to entertain people, stopping at the oasis there along the road from Babylon eastward, with tales of how it all worked out. In sum, Achaemenid art is a primary historical source, a cultural text from within the imperial culture. It's precious evidence, not least because so many of the historical sources come to us from classical texts composed by authors who often had their own axes to grind, and reasons for pandering to an exoticization and othering of the empire. Studying Achaemenid art invites us to try to appreciate the intended message system of the empire, stated through the mentality of the rulers who commissioned it. It certainly doesn't reveal some pure truth totally unencumbered by ulterior motive. It's nonetheless significant that these motives in self-presentation aimed at presenting a new way of being at empire that departed radically from earlier empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Its core message offered a coherent and consistent insistence upon a world order that was created with the spear, but was meant to be maintained and nurtured by an ideology of inclusiveness and spiritual complicity. Despite the seductive, even inspirational message of Achaemenid art, and despite the established fact that this art was reproduced in often in official contexts in multiple regional visual languages, the overarching burden of a Hellenocentric mindset continues to marginalize its potential impact on the global stage. This Hellenocentric mindset is born of and entrenched in Western learned traditions, which were continually reinforced over successive generations by European colonial agendas and their legitimizing behaviors. Western classic saturated education was steeped in the tales of Herodotus about the Persian Wars and the heroic battles of Greece against the gigantic, rapacious barbarian. The ruling classes were taught these tales as truths at the tutor's knee. So were the children who became colonial adventurers, early archaeologists, classicists, art historians. So were the budding Orientalists, who would go on to decode cuneiform script and to decipher the annals of Mesopotamian kings and the monumental texts of Darius and his successors. So too were the educated ranks of indigenous populations in the colonized lands of modern times, such as India. No matter how much new evidence continues to be brought to bear, no matter what new interpretive strategies are developed further to illuminate the Persian Empire, things seem to stay this way or get worse. We see this syndrome most clearly with reference to the art of Periclean Athens, and particularly the continuous frieze that adorned the Parthenon on the Acropolis. When I return to LA for the Getty Pourdavoud Symposium, I'll critique this systematically. For now, though, I simply note a couple of core historical tropes in closing that have been and continue to be sustained by this Hellenocentric mindset. Only two. First, Achaemenid art is described as frozen, deadly, lifeless, boring, monotonous. Every face looking like everyone else's. It's so deadly, so reflective of a wretched despotic vision and lived reality that it could not possibly have held any residence for official art planners beyond the enforced purview of imperial control. The sameness of classical sculpture physiognomies on the Parthenon frieze may be spoken of reverently as an attribute reflecting the unity and harmony of the Athenian family within a democratic society. Sameness in Achaemenid art is automatically dismissed as an attribute of the despotic condition in empire. The great Orientalist Ernst Herzfeld, who died in 1948, who excavated at Persepolis for the Oriental Institute in the early 30s, and on whose watch the fortification tablets were discovered, proclaimed in a one-liner in 1941, the utter polarity between East and West, between Persepolis and the Parthenon. Echoing and expanding upon Herzfeld, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, an archaeologist who worked in India and to whom we'll return in a second. Wheeler followed Herzfeld's lead in various publications, culminating in the late 1960s with his Flames over Persepolis. I quote, "The Parthenon and Persepolis are poles apart in every sort of fashion. In spiritual descent, they are each the impact of an utterly different ethos. Their only valid common factor is that within half a century, both in their diverse ways, immortalized state processions. It is the essential differences between the Greek and the Persian modes that matter. The sculptors of Persepolis were clamped down under gold guard. Their creations are patterns rather than persons, repetitive and tediously impassive. Through and through, the Greeks were significantly Europeans, the Persians, Asiatics." A very important underpinning of all this relates to concepts of Athenian democracy as a model for a virtuous West, with the Parthenon frieze being the quintessential expression of that civic virtue designed for and by a notional everyman. The nature of Athenian democracy, citizenship, family, was of course in actuality eminently exclusivistic, but never mind. Furthermore, historical analysis of Periclean Athens as an emergent, energetically aspirational empire in its own right are not part of the discourse for specialists in the Parthenon frieze. The notion of democracy versus empire seems totally entrenched. It enables continual reinforcement of tired tropes of the Persian Empire as a perpetually monstrous entity that makes a great foil of evil for the virtues of Athens. Many historians, text-based historians, acknowledge that in actuality, by the age of Pericles, the Persian imperial project had backed off from attempts to subsume mainland Greece and had become a key player in the chess game global diplomacy involving Greek city-states and the whole of the greater Mediterranean. No. This leads us to the second historiographic blind spot I'll mention today in closing. This involves the trope of Persepolis as hidden away, even off limits, meant for Persian eyes only and visited only by these Persians for the New Year's festival and for ceremonies involving the burial of the king. Persepolis is seen as not a real city in any sense, but only a stage set, an unpopulated stage set. This is not the case, as I hope I've helped you understand today. Classical testimonia frequently refer to Susa, not Persepolis, but misunderstanding of how the Persians referred to their city as Parsa, coterminous with Persia, is one factor that resolves this apparent oddity. We might also note that Alexander seems to have had no trouble figuring out that taking this place was key to taking the empire, and he apparently knew how to get there. Over 2,000 of the texts from the Persepolis Fortification Archive were published in English translation by Richard Halleck 50 years ago this year. These texts and the scholarship that has tended them since make it crystal clear that people visited Persepolis from afar and wide and traveled all over the empire via Persepolis in the reign of Darius. That the king traveled widely, including residency in Persepolis that was not limited to highly select ceremonial moments and seasons. The seal of a guide for elite travelers is used repeatedly on the fortification tablets, as you see here. The guide's name is Ishbaramishtima. But years ago, my students dubbed him Barry for short, so we could prattle on about him without getting tongue-tied in seminars. It also saves minutes off your class, and I know I'm running late. The guide's name is Barry, therefore. His seal can stand as an icon of a well-traveled mid-level man within the empire. It's carved in the local fortification style, so dubbed by Mark Garrison, because so many of the seals in our research corpus are carved in it. And Mark has demonstrated clearly that it developed into a canonical form through the dated tablets it appears on. The style is very simple in line and in modeling. Frequently it was used for seals that have a kind of pret-a-porter look about them. Here, Barry's seal was probably such an off-the-shelf item into which he requested that the archer figure be inserted. He may have seen the archer as an image of himself, the alert guide charged with keeping his client safe and supplied with every amenity. When we glimpse Barry here in the archive, he's taking a group of Indian gentlemen and their entourage back to India from the west, via Persepolis. This is Barry's world. The problem of an off-limits Persepolis has many ripple effects perpetuated in some published discussions of the empire, and also perpetuated in many maps. We see this even in a major learned publication produced by the British Museum to anthologize scholarly papers presented on the occasion of the wonderful 2005 exhibition on the Persian Empire. Unintentionally, to be sure, the map that stands for the world of Achaemenid Persia shows no road system such as we know existed all across the empire. All it indicates is one street, the Royal Road, as Herodotus talked about it, running from Sardis to Susa. It doesn't get close to Persepolis, let alone to the Indus Valley where Barry was headed with his elite clients, when Persepolis is silenced. as it so often continues to be. Scholars can explain that of course no Athenian of the decider class in the run-up to the planning of the Parthenon could ever have heard of Persepolis, much less seen it. But Persepolis is our main evidence on Achaemenid art, so well preserved and so rich in data. Persepolis and its programmatic visions could not possibly have had an impact on anything but some satrapal installations directly within the imperial domain. Persepolis is silenced. The great American poet Adrienne Rich, who died in 2012, spoke of cartographies of silence. She was considering the plights of womanhood, but her phrase is apt here, literally in terms of the problematics of mapping the Persian Empire, and figuratively in terms of how the aliveness of the empire has been so effectively disappeared. I know I'm running late. How late am I?
Quite late.
Quite late, okay. Maybe since we're quite late, I will have to skip the end. Which was about the columns of Ashoka of India, and wrap up instead. I'm so sorry, I'm embarrassed. But wrap up simply by saying that the lesson that I hope I'm trying to create here is that not only there were resonances across the empire in official contexts in the time of the Achaemenid Empire, but also that cultural memoryscapes and other factors, certainly in the Seleucid court, kept notions of Persepolitan imagery alive and allowed it to be, I submit, really a model for the great Mauryan Emperor Ashoka of India. There are double whammy issues of historiographic problematic here, where Persepolis and the Achaemenids for Indian archaeologists have in recent times become really a no-go zone. It's really unfortunate, but Persepolis is silenced from both sides, from the West and from the East now, in terms of scholarly contemplations amongst archaeologists, art historians. So this is too bad, but I think there's a lot of hope, and I will say that one of the hopes is in more field archaeology, not just in Achaemenid sites across the eastern zones, but also later antique Iranian sites. And we'll be hearing from Stefan Hauser about that sort of stuff, using research questions to make a site speak about the big world. Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry I kept you late.